5 years ago, I made a video about a dungeon I'd heard about inside of one of England's greatest castles, the Oubliette inside of Warwick Castle. Since then I've visited it many times, and coming face to face with the dark dungeon and cell is rather terrifying. Each time I'm confronted by the metal grille and the pitch black small chamber, and you can't help but think about the suffering that happened inside there. The Oubliette as a cell was intended to lock someone inside of, and then simply just forget about them. There was no way out, only death, and someone would be left there to rot, often with the remains of those who had gone before. When I made that first video, that did rather well. I was in no doubt about the existence of the Oubliette. But since then, there's been some speculation about it, and some have questioned whether the Oubliette inside Warwick may not actually be a torture dungeon at all, but something much more inconspicuous. But why could history's darkest dungeon actually be a lie? Let's first revisit what an oubliette is. In history, it's described as a torture cell in which someone was just left to rot and die inside of. The French term means to forget, and that was the intention, for someone to just starve to death in their suffering. The prisoner was also kept in very cramped conditions, and it was, truth be told, hell on earth. There's stories of rebels being left to just succumb to their fates. For example, during the reign of King John, one oubliette inside of Warwick Castle claimed the lives of a mother and her son, who had upset the king, and the mother even turned to the alleged worst sort of behaviour, cannibalism, to try and survive. The first time I'd seen the Warwick Castle oubliette was on a history documentary looking at Britain's greatest castles. The presenter showed the depth of the windowless cell and encapsulated how tragic a place it really was. This inspired me to investigate the oubliettes further, and over the past few years I've found many of these, from circular prisons inside Welsh castles with no chance of escape, to torture rooms inside different European castles. The oubliette was a thing, and it did exist. A room in which someone would be left to rot and die inside of is undeniable. But the Warwick Castle dungeon might not be this at all. In the corner of the castle is a prison, and this is undeniably a place where people for centuries were locked up and were held. There's graffiti on the walls of the dungeon, carved by suffering people who feared for their lives, and this allegedly was so feared that during the 100 Years' War, French prisoners even heard about it. People were held for ransom in the dungeon, and no doubt people suffered in there. In the mid-16th century, John Leyland, a writer, claimed, "The dungeon, now in ruins, stands in the west-northwest part of the castle." So even during the Tudor period, it was known that this was a dungeon. There are even records that claim that Piers Gaveston, the rumoured lover of King Edward II, was locked up there in 1312, and that King Edward IV may have also been locked up in that dungeon. During the late 16th century, the castle and rooms underground may have also been used as an overflow for the common prison. One piece of graffiti shows that Richard Fisher, in 1560, was locked up there and held in Caesar's Tower. During the English Civil War, there were also many people held in the dungeon. 3 Quakers in the 1650s were said to have been taken to the dungeon in Warwick Castle, 20 steps underground. The oubliette sits in the corner of this dungeon, through what would have been a door, ensuring a prisoner had no further chance of escape and interaction with those others held in the main dungeon. But a few years ago, I was alerted to a more pressing research project that had actually cast doubt on the room. The reference to an oubliette there, or a stinking vault, as the Chronicle states, was for the harshest punishment required. Today the guidebooks will tell anyone who visits about the oubliette that the castle's dungeon was the darkest in history. One book in 1815 stated, "A dungeon deep, damp and dark, exhibiting a horrible specimen of a place of subterranean imprisonment." Another says, "The dungeon has an unusual feature in its oubliette, a dungeon within a dungeon, where the unhappy prisoner had just sufficient room to lie in complete darkness." But what if that dungeon wasn't actually a dungeon at all, and in fact, the oubliette was just a drain leading to a sewer or a river? It's been claimed more recently that the Warwick Castle oubliette was, and I quote, "in reality a short shaft which opens up into a larger chamber with a latrine shaft entering it from above." This suggests that the chamber is in fact a partially backfilled drain. The positioning of the supposed oubliette within the large dungeon, situated in a small alcove, is typical of a garderobe or toilet arrangement within a medieval building. These factors perhaps point to the feature being the remnants of a latrine rather than a cell for holding prisoners. That does make sense. The shaft drains into the River Avon like all medieval toilets tended to do, with toilets leading into rivers or ditches. It also looks like a toilet, and there were clearly doors fitted to it for privacy. What if the oubliette was a toilet used for those held inside the larger dungeon? And this in a sense would be a better standard of imprisonment for higher ranking prisoners, giving them access to a toilet rather than just a bucket. But that does mean that one of history's darkest dungeons could in fact be a lie, and in fact just be a toilet. It's a bit of an anticlimax, but throughout the Victorian period there was an influx in tourism, and to get people into sites to visit, stories were crafted to inspire and invoke feelings within the population, so castles could get more money and greater entrance fees. For example, in the Tower of London, inside the church there, people still believe that Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, is buried under the altar, under a memorial stone, but her body has never been found and discovered. But do I think the Warwick Castle oubliette is a dungeon or not? I don't know, if I'm honest. Each year we find out incredible things about the past. Some disprove what we already know. Was it just propaganda to make more money? Possibly. But could it have been used as a dungeon? Possibly. This has been History of the World. If you've learned something new, click subscribe.